Hi guys, this is Andrew with Headphones.com. Welcome to the Headphone Show, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Audeze LCD-XC. This is a planar magnetic over-ear closed-back headphone that comes in right at around $12.99. Let's take a look. Just like with my other reviews, we'll talk about the build quality, design, and comfort. We'll talk about detail retrieval, speed, dynamics, soundstage, imaging, and timbre. We'll talk about frequency response and tonality, give a couple comparisons, then ultimately decide whether or not this is worth it. Of course, I've also published my full written review of this headphone up on headphones.com already, and this includes all the measurements that were done on the Gross standardized measurement rig. And so if you guys want to look at those measurements a little bit more closely, I'll leave a link in the description for that. But let's begin by talking about the build quality, design, and comfort of the Audeze LCD-XC. So when it comes to build quality, obviously the Audeze LCD-XC is a closed-back headphone, and that means we have these cups on the side here. If you look at the Audeze website, you can see that there are also additional backings to the cup. And so you don't have to get it with the wooden one here if you're interested in this. There's also a carbon fiber one, and I think a few other different designs that you can choose from. But from what I could find, this one here with the wooden cups is the lightest. And speaking of which, this comes in at around 700 grams. So it's too heavy, obviously. But with all that said, I mean, the build quality here I think is fantastic. This is one of the nicest looking headphones and one of the most well-built feeling headphones. You get the usual, really amazingly huge Audeze pads that are super thick and super cushiony. Everything about this feels premium, feels well built, high quality. Obviously, the whole thing isn't made out of wood, and this is just sort of the backing of the cup that's wood, but it looks really, really nice. They've done sort of a finish on top of it, and it feels really sturdy as well. But in general, 700 grams is too much for headphones, in my opinion. And so that is the biggest barrier to entry when it comes to these. But for the rest of the comfort, everything is actually great. The pads are, as I mentioned, really soft and cushiony. The headband strap here is really wide. This is the usual fare for Audeze. This is the newer headband design here that's very comfortable up top. You do also get clicks and extension for the headband or for the arms. And they do have a little bit of swivel there. So all of this is, the usual sort of Audeze build and design with the addition of these really nice wooden cups here. I'm just going to put this on so you guys can see what it looks like when I'm wearing it, because I know people are asking for that. So it actually doesn't look too ridiculous when you wear it, and it's comfortable for the most part. It's just that after a couple of hours, the weight is just, it starts to weigh down on you quite a bit. But everything about the headband and all this, it's all fantastic. It's just really too bad that this is so heavy, because this actually performs really, really well. Speaking of which, this is the LCD-XC, meaning this is the same driver as the LCD-X. It's just that they've closed it off, same diaphragm and whatnot. But let's talk about how this performs. For detail retrieval, I like to think of this category as image clarity. So if you think about, if you're looking through a window, how clear the window is, that's going to show you, the details better than if the window is smeared or opaque or whatever. So for that kind of detail retrieval and image clarity and the ability to sort of look into the music, through the window into the music, the Audeze LCD-XC, I think, is one of the very best closed-back headphones that I've ever heard. This is certainly the best closed-back planar magnetic headphone that I've heard yet, and I know the new Hi-Fi Man R10 is coming up soon, and so we'll see about potentially getting one of those in for review as well. But at the moment, this is sort of the top of the pile for closed-back planar magnetic headphones when it comes to detail retrieval. It's remarkably good, and actually, because this is closed-back, I actually feel like it gives a better sense of detail and image clarity and all that stuff, because there's no ambient noises that are creeping in there from the open back stuff. And I know closed back headphones, they have their drawbacks and they're not generally as good as the open back ones. But actually, as we'll see with this review, I actually think that the LCD-XC outperforms its open back counterpart. And both in terms of technical performance and in terms of frequency response. The detail retrieval here compared to the LCD-X, I think, is on par, which means that I think it's at least as good as the Hi-Fi Man Aria for that sense of internal detail retrieval. Obviously, it's not as easy to tell because the frequency responses are so different. But overall, I'm really impressed with this. And just to give you an idea, compared to the Focal Elegia, which is a little bit less expensive and a dynamic driver, the Audeze LCD-XC is clearly more detailed. This is way better image clarity than that one, even though, I really like that headphone. For speed and dynamics, the initial leading edge is very impressive here, as it is with many other planar magnetic headphones. But for dynamics, the LCD-XC actually punches really hard. I think this punches harder than the open back counterpart, the LCD-X. And this may just be due to the fact that it's a closed back, and this just creates an additional parameter there for what's possible with the macro dynamics. And again, for dynamics, I know people have different definitions of this stuff. There's micro dynamics and then there's macro dynamics. So when I'm talking about dynamics here, I'm talking more about the macro dynamics, which I consider to be, the softs to louds. And this is sort of the excursive quality there, the dynamic impact and punch and slam that a headphone has. And for that, for a planar magnetic headphone, the Audeze LCD-X is remarkably good. This is actually the best that I've ever heard in a planar magnetic headphone at this price range. Yes, the LCD4 I think does slam harder than this, but apart from that, I can't think of anything else that slams as hard as this does. So that's really, really good. For soundstage and imaging, the soundstage here is definitely tighter than that of the LCD-X. It's not as wide and as spacious and as open sounding because, of course, it is a closed back headphone. But what I really like about this is that for the LCD-XC, the overall image distribution feels very cohesive. With the LCD-X, the open back, I found that while it was pretty good laterally, the center image was pulled towards me a bit, and that sort of made it a little bit odd and disjointed sounding for the soundstage and the placement of all the images. With the XC, I don't have that issue because the width is not as wide. So overall, I mean, it might be a little bit tighter for left and right, but it is a little bit more in line with where I hear the center image to be. So I would put the soundstage here a little bit closer to that of something like the Focal Clear. So definitely not as spacious and open sounding as we might want, but really it's not that bad and it doesn't really hold it back all that much. It's not like one of the HD6X0 headphones that's really, really tight. And then importantly, the image separation and distinction, the thing that allows you to sort of isolate and pinpoint individual instrument lines in the mix is phenomenally good. Once again, this is one of the best that I've heard at this price point. It's just picture perfect for the image separation there. And when it comes to timbre, this is also surprisingly good. I was expecting it to have that sort of typical planar kind of dry quality, but this is sort of the opposite of that. And it's likely this is just due to, closing it off makes it so that there's maybe a little bit more length to the decay there, and that maybe gives an extra sense of this sort of euphonic quality. But in general, the timbre here, I have no issues with whatsoever. For frequency response related timbre, it's a little bit weird here, and we'll talk about that next. But overall, I'm actually surprised that it's not that bad. Again, in fact, overall, this is a headphone that surprised me in so many different ways because I was not expecting it to sound like this at all. When you think about an Audeze headphone, you generally think, okay, really good bass and, sort of a withdrawn upper mid-range. And so it lacks a little bit of that clarity there in the presence region. And that is not this headphone. This is not that, withdrawn and muted and muffled kind of upper mid-range sound. But let's get into it. So starting with the bass, you have really good bass extension as we would expect with an Audeze planar, but it does sit below the Harman shelf there. So this is actually a section that I do bump up a little bit with EQ. And then as it gets into the mids, it's a little bit forward there in the transition into the mid-range, but not too bad. And then as it gets into the upper mid-range, this is where I'm the most surprised by what this headphone has for frequency response. This actually has appropriate pinna gain there. So it does rise at the right spot for what our ears are imparting to the brain. So it rises in a way that our brain expects to hear. And it gets reasonably close to the target. Again, much closer than I was expecting, and much closer than just about every other Audeze headphone that I've heard, at least of the full-sized ones. And then once we get into, the lower treble, like maybe around 5K hertz, that's when things start to become a little bit problematic here. There's definitely an emphasis there around 5 to 6K hertz with this headphone. And then above that into the upper treble, it's just treble madness. It's just way too bright. But overall, the balance isn't terrible, and this is certainly better than many other headphones that I've heard for overall frequency response and tonality. And yes, it is too bright for my liking. If you're into bright headphones, this is actually something that I would recommend just by its default tonality. If you like that extra, air up there, above 12K hertz, that's fine. But for me, this is definitely too much. So I do, adjust that a little bit. But overall, if you just sort of look at the snapshot of the frequency response here, this is not like other Audeze headphones. This is a much more, let's say, classically normal sounding headphone for its, bass to mids to upper mids, and then it just keeps going with the counterclockwise tilt there for the treble, getting, ridiculous treble extension. And so, yeah, I mean, once again, it's too bright, but I still think that for the rest of its frequency response, it's really good. It's surprisingly good. Just one thing to note here with the frequency response, you'll see there's a bit of a dip there, or a cut there at around 4 to 4.5 kHz. And that I don't think is something to EQ, because it's just the way that all these Audeze headphones happen to measure. Because when you EQ that up, at least I don't hear that as being a necessary thing. It sounds a little wrong if you try and EQ that. So I think this is just part of the design that makes them have that dip there. So I just ignore that and just look at the overall tonal balance instead. So overall, the frequency response and tonality of the LCD-XC is not like other Audeze headphones at all. It's quite a bit more counterclockwise tilted. It's quite a bit brighter in general, but importantly, it has appropriate pinna gain in the upper mids, so it doesn't sound muted and muffled. It sounds much more clear there, and I really like that quality. And so if you're looking at buying a headphone like this without any EQ whatsoever, my pick would be the LCD-XC over the LCD-X for sure. Especially if you're looking at something that's a little bit more like reference sound. If that's kind of what you're after, then yeah, the XC is easily the better choice there. It's definitely more clear and maybe a little bit more analytic because of that 5 kHz emphasis, which I think is maybe a little bit too much there for me. But overall, yeah, this is the better tuning in my opinion. Now, of course, I do EQ my headphones, and I think with Audeze headphones, these are generally ones that they take EQ really, really well, meaning that, you don't hear any distortion or anything like that when you do it, and you can boost it by quite a bit, or, drop it or whatever you want to do, and they'll react to it appropriately. And with the LCD-XC, that's no exception. If you guys want to see my EQ profile for this, I have left it in my written review as well, which again is linked in the description. But just in general, what I do here is I just take a down shelf there for the treble, and then I only really add a bass shelf and maybe a little bit there in the mids to fix things a little bit. But for the most part, this is a very easy headphone to EQ. You don't have to add any super narrow peak filters or anything like that. Just sort of add a little bit more bass and then downshelf the treble to make it a little bit more in line. Or if you really like bright headphones, and if you're listening to like jazz, acoustic, classical music, you might not actually need to EQ this. This might line up with what you like. For me, it's just a little bit too bright there, and I like to have the bass shelf from the 2013 Harman Target, so I do add that there. And then of course, alternatively, if you want to change this without using any software or doing any kind of EQ, you can use something like an RME ADI2, or use like an IFI amp that has the bass boost function. You can just add that and it'll take it just fine. And speaking of which, this is actually not too difficult to drive. Once again, you look at this and you think this is huge. This probably takes a lot of power to drive, but really not that much, just like the LCD-X. Now, let's give a couple comparisons. Compared to the Focal Elegia, which is quite a bit less expensive than this, but I think it's also discontinued now. Yeah, the LCD-XC is just far superior for its technicalities, for its detail and image clarity and all that stuff. It's impressive how much better this is for that sense of image clarity and all that stuff. Compared to the Focal Stellia, which is the higher end dynamic driver closeback from Focal, the LCD-XC, I think, competes very well for its technical performance. The Stellia has an overall more agreeable frequency response. It's a lot more balanced there. But I think for its technicalities, I think the LCD-XC is right up there with those ones. I'd have to compare this with the Verite Closed, which I haven't had a chance to review yet. Maybe one day I'll be able to do that, but at the moment, I think this is a strong contender for most technical performance, or best technical performance for a closed-back headphone. Obviously, though, the biggest difference there with the Focal Stellia is that it's quite a bit warmer, and it's quite a bit more balanced overall for its sound signature, while the Audeze LCD-XC is quite a bit brighter and just kind of insane in the treble. So again, if you're not going to be EQing anything, I still would recommend the Focal Stellia. And I don't think that the LCD-XC is better than the Stellia necessarily for detail, because it's just so weird to compare planar versus dynamic driver headphones. But I do think it competes. I think it's right up there. And, competing with headphones that cost quite a bit more, even if you compare this to open back counterparts, like I think the detail here is better than that of the Focal Clear. I think it's better than the Auteur. I think it's, maybe like at least as good as the Hi-Fi Man Aria, but of course the Aria's tonal balance is better, and the soundstage is way better, and the depth and layering is way better, and the image separation is better. So it really just depends on what you're looking for. but it's still impressive that this is able to compete with headphones that cost quite a bit more money. Compared to the Audeze LCD-2 closed, yeah, this is also far better, in my opinion, both in terms of its overall tonal balance, even without EQ, and its technical performance. So for the detail retrieval and all that stuff, it's definitely better than the LCD-2 closed, which, while it was impressive for its slam and its articulation in the bass, I found that the overall balance there was just odd. So I think this is easily worth the price increase over the LCD-2 closed. And then compared to the Aeon 2 closed, which is the other important closed-back planar magnetic headphone, while the Aeon 2 closed is really good for detail, the LCD-XC is still a cut above there. And then, of course, the Aeon 2, it's also quite a bit more bass and lower mid-focused with an upper mid-range recession. I mean, in a way, the Aeon 2 closed sounds a little bit more like what I would expect a closed-back Audeze to sound like. And the LCD-XC sounds a little bit closer to like the original Aeon closed, which was like quite a bit more like, linear there and not as bass-focused. And I know you guys are going to ask me to compare this to the Ether closed. The LCD-XC is quite a bit better technically for all categories, essentially. Really, if you're choosing between the two and you don't mind the weight of this, I highly recommend the LCD-XC over that one. And then, people are going to ask about the CX and stuff like that. And in my opinion, if you're going to be going with a Dan Clark Audio headphone that's a closeback, I think the best one is still the Aeon 2 closed. Maybe the original Aeon RT, but again, the detail of the Aeon 2 there is better. So in my opinion, the distance between the Aeon 2 closed and the LCD-2 closed, between those ones and the LCD-XC, I think is significant enough to warrant the price increase for the LCD-XC. I think it's just categorically superior in every single category. The only real consideration, in my opinion, with that stuff is weight. And of course, if you're okay with a brighter or more counterclockwise tilted frequency response there, and whether or not you EQ, of course. So in conclusion, do I recommend the Audeze LCD-XC? Well, again, I'm so surprised by this headphone, and I was not expecting it to sound like this. I was not expecting it to have the appropriate upper mid-range pin gain. I was expecting this to be similarly recessed there and just a little bit weird in the mids and upper mids, like some of the other Audeze headphones are, like the LCD-X, like the LCD-2, like the LCD-4. And this really is not. This is quite a bit more balanced there for the upper mids. And I think if you're into a brighter and more analytic kind of sound, and you still want the like hyper detail, like crazy amount of slam, really good technical performance, then, yes, I would recommend this without EQ. I think that's fine. But for my taste and my preference, I prefer this with EQ because I like to add more bass and I like to curb some of the treble there a little bit. But when that's done, this is a headphone that if it weren't for the weight, if it weren't for the 700 grams, I would buy this. I'm always on the lookout for high-end closeback headphones because, if I'm rendering a video, my computer fans start to spin up or there's just ambient sounds around, and I love the ability to just sort of close everything off. And this is exactly that. This is exactly the technical performance I'm looking for. Yeah, maybe the tonality is a little bit bright there for me, but I can just EQ it with very easy filters here. And even if you're just doing this in Roon, it's very easy to do with the LCD-XC. So yes, I do recommend the LCD-XC if you're comfortable with the idea of a heavy 700 gram headphone. Personally, that's the barrier. I can't get over that, but if you're okay with that, I absolutely recommend this. And in fact, I'd recommend this over the LCD-X because for all of the nice things about the LCD-X, the LCD-XC isn't that much heavier. You get a closeback. It has potentially better slam, at least in my opinion, it slams harder. And it also has a more agreeable frequency response in the upper mids, even though, yes, it is a little bit more analytic and a little bit more intense there in the treble. So, it's a trade-off, but I think it's worth it because the LCD-X, at least this one from early 2020 that I had reviewed not long ago, it's completely gone there in the upper mids, which I think that one is more of a, it requires EQ kind of thing, whereas the LCD-XC is more of a, yeah, you might want to EQ this if it's too bright for you kind of thing. One last thing to mention regarding EQ and DSP, they do provide a Reveal Plus preset for the Audeze LCD-XC, but I don't recommend using it. I think it probably needs to be updated, or maybe it has been updated and I'm just using an older version, or the free version is not updated, something like that. Because when I used the Reveal Plus on the LCD-XC, it completely ruined it. It was not right whatsoever. And it's really, really weird sounding when you use the Reveal Plus for this one. So I would EQ this one based on the preset that I've kind of started with, or just do it by ear. And it's really not hard to do. Like, just drop a little bit of the treble there, add a little bit of bass, and then, you know, maybe fix some of the stuff in the mid-range there, but that's pretty much all you need to do. The other consideration is that, you know, with all of these, because the pads are so huge, there is a little bit of unit variation there. I'm led to believe that the drivers are not actually all that responsible for the unit variation that you sometimes see with these. It's more to do with the fact that the pads here are huge. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but there is a chance that you might see a measurement of this headphone that looks a little different from the one that I've shown here. Anyways, that does it for this review. If you guys like what I'm doing here, consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.